Good morning, everyone. The rigor of an analytical economist and the passion of an activist can be a powerful combination, and Bina Agarwal is proof of that. As an economist examining how development is related to poverty, gender, and the environment, she has become an influential voice for the rural poor of India and the world. Her current position as Director and Professor of Economics at the Institute of Economic Growth at the University of Delhi puts her in the forefront of scholarship and policymaking on development issues. Dr. Agarwal's life as an economist began with a bachelor's degree from the University of Delhi. After a second undergraduate degree from the University of Cambridge, she continued there with a master's degree before completing her PhD at the University of Delhi. A few years later, she would begin her long association with that university's Institute of Economic Growth. While based at that institution, Dr. Agarwal has held positions at many of the world's most prestigious universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, Michigan, and Minnesota, among others. Dr. Agarwal's writings are extensive, with a diversity of style, audience, and subject matter that is exceedingly rare in the highly specialized world of academia. They include 5 authored books, plus 4 edited books, over 70 journal articles, numerous other articles and commentaries, and even a book of poetry. First published in 1994, A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, earned widespread acclaim for its thorough interdisciplinary analysis of women's poverty and property rights in South Asia. Her latest book, Gender and Green Governance, The Political Economy of Women's Presence Within and Beyond Community Forestry, examines how an increased role for women in forestry management institutions could impact the use of these resources. Dr. Agarwal's work has been recognized with numerous awards. In 2005, she was the first recipient of India's Ramesh Chandra Award of Excellence for outstanding contributions to agricultural economics. She received the Padma Shri President's National Award for Education and Economics from the Government of India in 2008, and most recently the 2010 Leontief Prize from the Global Development and Economic Institute at Tufts University. More importantly, Dr. Agarwal's work has had real impact on the lives of the people of rural India, especially women. She played a key role in the reform of India's inheritance laws, which for the first time granted women and men equal rights in land ownership and access to property. Although an economist by training, Dr. Agarwal's work is truly multidisciplinary, relying on history, anthropology, political science, and other fields. Most fundamentally, her work truly relies on evidence. In her words, she trusts the data more than models. Finding this data can mean spending countless hours poring over the dissertation collection of the Harvard Library or going to villages she is studying to see firsthand how these communities function. Her reliance on data, observation, and the lessons of history exemplifies what good economics is and why understanding economics is important to solving the world's most pressing problems. Today, we'll be presenting Can We Make Food Good for All? Please welcome to Nobel Conference 46, Bina Agarwal.
Thank you. Just trying to organize myself here a little bit. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted and pleased to be here today. This is not my first visit to Minnesota, but I must say it's one of the most splendidly beautiful, sunny periods that I've been here at. And I'm really, really grateful for the organizers for organizing that. I'm really honored and delighted to be at this conference, which is on such an important topic. And I thank Gustavus College for thinking of me and bringing me here. There's so much background work that has gone into it. I thank President Oli, Lisa Helke, Czech, and Neda Ryder, who was on email with me every day. He probably woke up very early in the morning to reach me by email. I really thank him. I thank Jeffrey Owen for taking such good care of me during this conference and for this very generous introduction. And to the two hidden helpers, Max and Bonnie, who have been taking care of me as well. So that's a lot of people taking care of me. So today I'll be talking about can we make food good for all? Now, long before I knew the difference between good and bad food, I knew the rules of my mother's kitchen. Now, the kitchen was a sacred space where the gods resided, and it was literally because that's where her deities sat. The floor was washed every day, and you could only enter on clean, bare feet. We were strict vegetarians, so even garlic and onion were banned, and the cook had to bathe before cooking and keep quiet while cooking. Cooking was meant to be a meditative act. So according to Indian scriptures, food carries the life force, and it impinges on our consciousness. Not only does the content matter, but also how food is prepared and eaten. And the Hindu scriptures divide food into three categories. There's sattvic food, which is supposed to be pure, clean, and wholesome. And according to the Bhagavad Gita, which was written sometime between 500 and 200 BC, it describes sattvic diets as promoting life, virtue, strength, health, happiness, and satisfaction. It is food that should leave us calm, alert, and refreshed, and to improve our concentration and balance your moods. It is best prepared with love and eaten with pleasure, since emotions affect the food cooked, and what we eat affects our moods. Now, that's, of course, a tall order for any food, but sattvic food was supposed to grant you all those magic wishes. Freshly prepared organic food, vegetarian food containing whole grain. I think there's an arrow here, but I'm not quite figured out. Yes. This is sattvic food. Now, sattvic food is food which is, whole grain, vegetables, fruits, milk products is considered sattvic. Then there's rajasic food, which is, by contrast, is described as food which overstimulates and agitates. It is food which is excessively pungent, sour, salty, hot, leading to misery and sickness. So hot, spicy, and fried food, refined cereals, non-vegetarian items all fall in this category. I'm afraid all of us probably are seen as having rajasic food. Tamasic food is that which is stale, tasteless, smelly, leftover, rotten, foul. All that makes you feel sluggish. Now, fresh meat is rajasic, old meat is tamasic. So what makes food good, therefore, is what it consists of, what the ingredients are that are used to prepare it, in what state of mind it is cooked, in what state of mind it is eaten. Moderation and balance is the key. I think that was the message of yesterday's talks as well. Now, you may ask, was this really practiced? Well, actually, yes, by many. Now, I had an elderly aunt who took all these dictums rather seriously. And whenever she visited us, she would take full charge of the kitchen. So when she ate, she would sit down on the kitchen floor, right on a mat, guarding the entrance. And while she ate, she would keep mum. So we could only communicate with her in sign language. So once when I was about 5, I saw a scorpion that was creeping along the ledge near her. And I made frantic faces to warn her. But she was totally unflapped. And she finished her meal, and then she simply chased the nasty away with a broom. So we never figured out if her calm was due to sattvic food or it was simply inborn temperament. Now, these links between food and mood, between the cook's emotions and its effect on the taster, of course, are not unique to India. You will find references in Latin American literature, on magic realism. And you may have seen films like Water for Chocolate and Babette's Feast. Now, Babette's Feast is, of course, an ode to French cooking, and it has a transformative effect, if you remember, on the lives of the feasters. So traditional notions of good food, therefore, varied across culture, religion, and region. And somebody tried to make this map of the foods that are particularly in different parts of the country in India. And as you can see, just by the colors, that how varied is the cuisine across the country. I must say the tourist guide will probably tell you as much. The question is, of course, how many can afford the food that their culture or nutritionists define as good food? For millions of poor people globally, any food is good food, and nutritious food is a luxury. Clean and adequate fuel to cook food is also a luxury for many, as is access to clean water to cook and to drink. Now, global hunger, as we know, is widespread, and the UN Food and Agricultural Organization estimates there are about 800 million hungry people in the developing world. And until recently, the figure worldwide was 1 billion, which yesterday, as we know, had come down to 925 million. But that's still a very, very large number of people undernourished, and it comes to almost 15% of the current population of 6.6 billion. Now, 90% of the hungry and undernourished in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are, as you can see from this map, the predominant are in the developing countries are undernourished. And nearly also very large numbers of children suffer from malnutrition, and about 1 million people lack safe drinking water. Now, by 2050, the world population will be about 9 billion. And even without climate change, we will therefore need extraordinary efforts to meet their food security needs. With climate change, the task will be enormous. So how do we make good food available to all? What I will do is devote the rest of my talk to trying to address this, and I will speak in two parts. Firstly, what are the challenges of production, of distribution, preparation, and of consumption? And then, so there's a fair amount of bad news there. But then I also hope to provide some reflections on how we might move towards solutions. And I hope there are some inspirational stories there. Now, adequacy of good food, of course, depends on adequate production, its equitable distribution, clean fuel for its preparation, and these issues have both local and global dimensions. So let's take production, for instance. Now, food production, we know, draws on the Earth's basic resources of soil, water, and forests, mediated by climate and technology. The Earth's resources and climate are location-specific. So it's not surprising that there is a strong regional concentration of food production, especially of staple cereals, wheat, rice, and maize. These provide 92% of the cereals that are globally consumed. Wheat and rice alone provide about 42% of all food protein. Rice is especially important for the world's poor. So these are basic questions. Which countries are producing food grains? Which countries are exporting or importing food grains? And who are the farmers? Now, today, over 90% of the world's rice and 42% of total cereals are produced in Asia. Another 42% of cereals are produced in North America and Europe. But there's obviously, as you can see, if you look at the next slide, you can see that there is a clear division between food surplus and food deficit regions. The net surplus exporters are all in the developed countries, while the net cereal importers are the developing countries. So you can see these are the importers and these are the exporters. What this means is that policies that are followed in particular countries and regions can have a major impact on global food grain availability and access. So for instance, if you have a shift of land from major exporting countries, such as the United States, from say, if you move land from maize for food production to maize for biofuels, such as ethanol, due to subsidies that are given to energy crops, these can have an adverse effect on world food security. And I understand that it's now, there's a federal mandate in the energy bill in the United States that by 2012, several billion gallons of ethanol must be added to gasoline. So what we need to then take into account is that there is an associated reduction in food availability. And this can be a cause of concern, especially to food importing countries, poor food importing countries. Similarly, if you have low production and overall neglect of agriculture in developing countries, as you find in recent decades, then that can have significant implications for food security in those regions. Here, what you find is that food grain production has not kept pace with needs. And this is especially the case in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where yields have been low and far from what they could potentially be. I'd like to focus especially on these production inefficiencies. Now, what you find is that if you look globally, agriculture provides only a small and decreasing % of the gross domestic product of all regions except Sub-Saharan Africa, where it remains high. But the % of population in agriculture in most parts of the world is also, as you can see, low and declining. But in Asia and Africa, the top two lines, you'll see that agriculture still provides a very substantial part of the livelihoods security for a vast majority. And Asia and Africa also where a large part of the population of the developing world lives and where a large part of the poor in the world live. So what is produced there and how well the farmers are doing there is of great importance in terms of world food security. But who are the world's farmers? And typically you find that in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the farmers tend to be really small in size. In South Asia, 80% of the farmers own less than 2 hectares of farms. So if you look at the fields in the United States, in Iowa, in Minnesota, you'd probably think of a medium-sized farm, which is several hundred hectares. But here you're talking about 2 hectares or less. And most of these fields are irrigated, unirrigated, and fragmented. Also, what is forgotten, we tend to forget the human face of the farmer. And what you find is the growing % of the farmers are, if you see this slide, a large increasing proportion of the farmers are female, because men have more than women moved out of agriculture to non-farm jobs. So overall, Asian women constitute about 40%, and in some countries about 50% of the workforce. In Sub-Saharan Africa, women are the main food producers. And here, if you see, these are some of the faces of the farmers. So this indicates that in most regions of the world where it is, except in Oceania, in most regions of the world, the % of women is declining, but in the top regions, Asia, Africa, Oceania, you see an upward trend. But what you also have is well-documented class and gender biases in the access of farmers to agricultural land, to technical information, to credit, to extension services, to inputs, to storage facilities, to marketing options. Most of the systems that deliver information on new technology and practices are not geared to reach women. So unless we take steps to bridge these gender gaps, efforts to increase agricultural production and to alleviate hunger will remain largely ineffective. Equally, efforts are needed to deal with long-term misuse and overuse of our natural resources. As we know, our soils are getting depleted through overuse and excessive chemicals. We see falling water tables from overdrawing of groundwater for irrigation. And production has therefore become low, non-sustainable, and much below potential. In addition, and we tend to, when we talk about agriculture and we talk about fields, we tend to forget about forests. But forests and local commons are also declining. And yesterday we heard the story of biodiversity, but forests, of course, are a very major source of biodiversity. And this has immediate and also indirect implications for food security. Because forests provide important supplementary items in the diets of especially of the rural poor. Women are the main collectors of these items, and there have been a number of surveys. For instance, there was a 2005 survey in South India where village women identified 79 species of uncultivated leafy greens that they gathered for food in addition to roots, tubers, fruit, and so on. In rural Bangladesh, uncultivated plants provide in many areas 65% of the food weight of poor households. And the same is true in Africa, as you can see from this slide. As forests decline, so does access to these foods, as well as women's knowledge about them. So the issue of biodiversity is both about the availability of biodiversity in some generic sense, but also people's access to biodiversity for food security and their knowledge of that biodiversity, because this is not something that can be picked from the market always. At the same time, along with this is the looming shadow of climate change. Now, with climate change, again, these are stories we already know. Water sources are expected to dry up, rainfall will become more erratic, droughts and floods will increase. I believe you had very severe rainfall here near St. Peter till last week. In Pakistan, there have been floods. In India, we've had uncharacteristic rains till last month. But with these, as we were reminded yesterday, temperatures will rise, which will cause heat stress for crops. All this will affect food production unless we take steps to mitigate it. Now, last year, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., using IPCC data, made some projections, and it made the following projections. That climate change will dramatically reduce food grain output. And yields of most basic crops, as you can see globally, the yields will decline if you take rice, wheat, and maize. But what's also important to see from this graph, from this table, is that there are regional specificities, that South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa will be among the worst affected. And there are parts of other regions which may do a little better, or there'll be mixed effects. Now, therefore, without steps to mitigate this, world food production of, say, rice, which, as you remember, I had mentioned, rice is the basic staple for the large majority of the world's poor. If you take the production of rice, then the production will be no different in 2050 than this is the actual production of rice. This is 391 million metric tons in 2000, and this is projection for 2050. So without any mitigating steps, you'll find that it may be no different as a result of climate change. What this means is that population, of course, meanwhile, has been increasing and will continue to increase up to 2050. And per capita availability, caloric availability, therefore, will be lower in 2050 relative to 2000 throughout the developing world. And one can then doesn't require too much imagination to see what it might mean for different categories of people, and especially for children. Now, low production, of course, means also increase in prices for all major food grains, and higher food grain prices will lead to higher meat prices. So the worst affected, again, will be the poor farmers and those who are net buyers of food grains, and especially women and children are expected to be particularly affected. So this is part of the bad news on production. Then there is the question of distribution of food. So even if you have plenty of food, how is it distributed? Will everybody have access to the food available? And this is an issue which is both national and international. Now, in national terms, you may remember that Nobel laureate Amartya Sen had argued that what matters is, for access to food, is a person's entitlement to food, and not just aggregate food supply. So you can have plenty of food and still have you can have famine in particular regions, or at least historically you could. Now, according to Sen's entitlement approach, people's ability to command food depends on their ownership endowments, their access to land and labor, and the exchange entitlement mappings. That is, are you able to exchange that for food, say by finding employment or cultivating your own food? Now, to this, we can add other forms of entitlements, which Sen doesn't talk about, such as access to forests and common food resources, and also access to support from governments. A large part of the hunger and want that we see today is due to entitlement failure. So in the rural areas of Asia and Africa, many don't have access to cultivable land or water to produce enough food for subsistence. Nor do they have access to forests for collecting food, or enough money to buy food. Employment is limited, earnings are low, skills for better paying jobs are also limited, and if food prices rise, so do the world's hungry. Now, the 2008 world food prices, when there was a spike, as you remember, it added an estimated 100 million to the world's poor and hungry. So both local and global responses affect hunger and malnourishment. Global, if there is a famine, or globally, if there's a famine or drought in one country, its ability to emerge out of the crisis depends on the responses of other countries. The third part of the story is, how do we prepare food? We may have food grains at home, but do we have enough cooking energy to prepare it? So just as there can be food poverty, so there can be poverty of clean cooking fuel in many parts of the world. Now, did you know that 90% of rural households in sub-Saharan Africa and 70 to 90% in India and China, they use the bulk of the domestic cooking energy comes from unprocessed biofuels, which is firewood predominantly, and then crop waste and animal dung. Now, these are not clean cooking fuels, but many families lack even access to firewood. So if you have inadequate firewood, it just means your journeys to collect them get longer and longer, because in many rural areas, you can't simply go to a supermarket or to a shop to buy firewood. If you don't have enough firewood, it means you might not cook a meal. Instead of 2 meals, you might cook 1 meal, or you might eat cold leftovers, which could be toxic in a hot climate. And the rural African women often say, it's not what's in the pot that worries you, but what's under it, or rather what's not under it. Also, firewood, crop waste, and dung, if you use them in really poor ventilated kitchens, they can have life-threatening effects. So the smoke, now if you see this picture, it's not just a bad picture. It's not like the photographer has got black parts in it. It is really smoke that has caused the walls to be black. And what it causes is acute respiratory infections, which can lead to cataracts, birth defects, even cancer. And again, the worst affected, of course, are people who spend most time in the kitchen, which are women and the children who play around them. So in India, for instance, women's mortality risk from smoky kitchens is found to be 50% higher than men's. And we also find, here's another picture, as you see, this is a one-room house, and you have the little child on the mother's lap here. Several thousand children die in India every year because of acute respiratory infections from unprocessed and unclean fuels in poorly ventilated kitchens. But what if you had enough food and fuel? Would you still be eating good food? About this, we heard a great deal yesterday, and not necessarily is the answer. You may be eating fast food full of saturated fats or sweeteners, or because of lack of awareness, or because your friends are doing so. We are, in fact, moving towards a globalization of food habits. So even if you go into any remote parts of Bangladesh or India or sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find that the people are eating from fast food chains, over-the-counter food, food of low nutritional value. So here are some pictures. Here's McDonald's in China. And you find the same, you find it in larger towns, at least in India. And of course, there is the question of overweight, obesity that we heard about yesterday. Now, what is important, I think yesterday we heard the biological story about and the genetic aspects of obesity. But in food scarce context, the story yesterday was particularly in food surplus context, but in food scarce context, what you find is that as incomes are increasing, people are becoming obese because of bad food habits. What they see happening in other parts of the globe, children in particular, think it's cool to have exactly those items. And so, say if I come to the United States, my nephews will ask me to get all the cereals which yesterday Marion was telling us not to eat, because those are the items that are advertised. So how do we deal with these challenges of production, distribution, and preparation of good food for everyone? Now, of course, there are no easy answers, and I think all of us need to reflect on this. So what I will share with you is some reflections on what we might think about. What we need is higher production, equitable distribution, clean preparation, and nutritious consumption. But in all these, what I'm going to argue today is a critical ingredient is efforts of cooperation between communities nationally and cooperation across countries internationally. Let me first talk about the national level. Now, there's a great deal of agreement that for increasing a country's food production, we need more rural infrastructure. We need efficient agricultural practices. We need measures to restore our soil. We conserve our waters, to regenerate our forests. But we do need to ask, what kind of infrastructure do we need? So in a country like India today, only 42% of the net cultivated area is irrigated, which means there's a huge potential, if you irrigate the rest, for increasing output just by increasing irrigation. But what sort of irrigation? Should we go for large dams? Or should we go for local irrigation systems? Now, there was an Indian Prime Minister, a very major figure in our independence movement, who saw large dams as the temples of modern India. But as we know, large dams have high environmental and human costs. Community-managed systems are less sexy, but they are beginning to make inroads. You see, if you go back historically in countries of South Asia, you'll find that there were rainwater harvesting systems which go back. Here's an example of an ancient step well, but many of them have gotten neglected. However, if you look at this picture, it's less dramatic and wonderful in terms of architecture, but these are new rainwater harvesting systems. And if you see the top picture gives you, it's a simple kind of tank which stores water, and below you can see a recharged well. So these are these methods, of course, are smaller scale, more micro. They require community cooperation, but in the long run, they're probably more sustainable. And this is also seen in India. So for instance, in India, the long-term agricultural rate of growth has been barely between 2.5 to 3% per year. But in Gujarat state, which is in Western India, agriculture has grown at 10% per year for many years. And a key factor in that has been groundwater recharge with rainwater harvesting systems. And as I said, some of these systems go back several hundred years, but there are also these newer systems. And to revive them through community cooperation could be one way forward. A second point I want to raise is that we need new institutional innovations. We know that small farmers are very small, especially women farmers. Can they make localized investments in soil revival, in water conservation, to increase yields? Because of the many constraints that they face, if you're a really small farmer, and even if you go to a government official, not only do you not have enough resources to purchase seeds, if you want to buy seeds or any of the inputs, but also nobody listens to you. Now, how do we overcome these constraints? And I believe an imaginative institutional innovation could be more collective approaches to agricultural investment in farming. Now, joint investment in things like irrigation actually go back several hundred years in parts of South Asia. where farmers, 2 or 3 farmers would get together to invest in a tube well. But what I'd like to suggest today is something which is much more of a leap of imagination, which is, how about if we thought about farmers in small groups pooling their land to form what I term a collectivity. Now, I know the term collective rings off alarm bells in people's minds, and they say, but socialist collectivization had disastrous results. And of course it did, and you're right. So for instance, here is a terrible picture of the Ukraine famine, where several thousands of children and adults died, but particularly children. Now, that is not the route I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that we need a very different bottom-up, participative, small group approach to forming collectivities, as I term them. And these, I formulated here 6 principles: that it should be voluntary, small size, could be 10 to 15 people or families. They should be socioeconomically homogeneous. They should all be small and poor. There should be participatory decision-making. There should be checks and free riding, by which it's a term we economists use all the time, but basically it means that some people do the work and others sit back and enjoy the fruits of it. I'm sure we all know free riders, and we've been free riders ourselves from time to time. But in a collectivity, what you want is checks and balances for free riding, and you want fair and transparent distribution. So this is very different from the kind of top-down coercive collectivization which took place earlier. Now, what could be the advantages of this kind of pooling land and group farming? Many advantages. Firstly, you'll have more arable land because you won't have divisions between your fields. You'll be able to share labor if there's labor shortage. You would have better access to credit, to inputs, and to information. You'd be able to share the risks of higher value production. You'd have more bargaining power. And this is very important, because if you go as a group, and there are all kinds of new opportunities opening up for higher value crops and contract farming, but individual farmers are not able to take advantage of that, and they can often be exploited because they don't have crop insurance. But if there's a group, then they can go in for crop insurance. They can actually read the small print in the contracts they sign, and it would be less exploitative. Also, not every family or every person has the diversity of skills and knowledge needed, but if you work as a group, it is possible. And then there's less social and economic isolation. So all these factors would be potential advantages. Now, you might say, well, all this is fine, but does it work in practice? And I want to share with you examples where indeed it is. And there are 2 kinds of examples globally of successful cooperation by farmers who have pooled their land and skills. Now, the first type of example comes from the transition economies, and the second comes from India. In the transition economies of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, large-scale collectivization in the 50s and 70s, up to the 70s, was followed by decollectivization. So earlier what happened was, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was that the government said, well, farmers must come together and they must jointly cultivate, and you have several thousand hectares of, each farm was several thousand hectares, very large farms. And they followed none of the principles that I had mentioned just now of a successful cooperative. What is very interesting is that in the 80s and 90s, governments in the transition economies, which would be in Latin America and Eastern Europe, said, well, this is not working, so people can go back to individual family farming. When they had the choice, in many cases, they didn't go back to individual family farming. In fact, they formed small collectivities, which is small numbers of families got together. There could be 3 families, 4 families, up to 10 to 15 families, because individually they didn't have adequate machinery or labor or land to take advantage and to cultivate sustainably. But if they came together, they were able to do that. And these are not just small numbers. So for instance, in Romania, in the mid-90s, around 43% of the decollectivized agricultural land had returned to cooperative forms of production on a voluntary basis. In Kyrgyzstan, family cooperatives constituted 64% of all farm enterprises in 1997. And there are also examples of farmers in East Germany, in Nicaragua, constituting bottom-up cooperative farming after decollectivization. So they actually have many of these features that I have listed here. Now, these cooperatives have proved to be much more efficient than individual family farms. And in recent studies, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, in Romania, and East Germany, they find that crop income is much higher. For instance, in Kyrgyzstan, annual crop income was found to be 1.8 times higher in family cooperatives than in individual family farms. In Romania, again, there were substantially higher crop yields relative to individual farms. In East Germany also, the return from inputs was much greater on family cooperatives. Now, I use the term collectivities to get away from either the notion of collectives or cooperatives, but basically you find that such collectivities are able to help farmers secure access to credit, economies of scale, pool their labor, credit and marketing, and they all participate jointly in decision-making. And most importantly, many of them, when you talk to them, I haven't done direct research, but colleagues have, and they say they enjoy working together. So here's an example of a more modern family cooperative in Romania. My second example comes from India, and here farmers in some regions are not only pooling their finances for joint irrigation, but women's groups in as many as 79 to 80 villages in South India are jointly farming. And the groups are quite small, 8 to 10 women. They lease in land in groups, and they pool their owned plots. And some of them are able to do that because there's a government scheme for a grant cum subsidized credit in which they can actually purchase land jointly. Now, what is important is that whether they lease in land as a group or they purchase land as a group, they're actually cultivating it together. So if you've got, say, if you purchase 10 hectares, you register a hectare each in each woman's name, and then you pool it together to cultivate it. And they preserve their own seeds, they practice organic farming. It's not irrigated, and it's really harsh conditions, and yet you find that they are food secure. And here are some pictures from these villages. So here's that women's group which is doing land preparation. And here they're doing their weeding. And there are a number of other pictures, but I thought you might enjoy seeing this. This woman is preserving seeds, and there are numerous varieties. I remember she had these little pots in which she preserved traditional variety of seeds. So here is a little seed vault, if you like. And perhaps when the vault in Norway opens up for these women farmers and not just governments, perhaps her seeds might also be stored there. Now, with group cultivation, women have more access to government officials, to markets. They get much more priority from male farmers, and they take care of free riding. So, for instance, I've sat in on many of these meetings that the women farmers have, these groups have. And if somebody hasn't come in for work, they'll ask her, well, you know, why didn't you come in yesterday? And if she says she's ill, then they say, well, that's all right, but next time send somebody else to substitute for you. But if they learn that she has gone and worked on somebody else's field and earned twice as much, then she is penalized, and she has to then pay the group the wages for that day. So there are methods of checking free riding, and what you find is productivity is higher than in individual family farming. What is important is that the group members report better diets, they report better health care, children's education, higher wages when they need work. And they also say that there's less domestic violence, and they have better status in the community. Now, many of these are very low-caste women. So they say, for them, there's a word called amma, which is used as respect. And for the first time, the government officials and the landlords use the term amma after their name. So it's a sign of self-respect. In many villages also, women's groups have set up community grain banks to help as many as, the last figure I saw was 5,500 poor families obtain food grains at very low cost, thus enhancing community food security. Now, both types of examples, those from the transition economies and from South India, demonstrate that farmers can voluntarily form production collectivities. Now, in the India example, I find particularly compelling because it has increased food security for the most vulnerable, namely women and children in poor, low-caste households. Now, you may ask, what about geographic coverage? Now, in the transition economies, as I mentioned, the coverage is already pretty high. They cover 43% of farm area in Romania, 64% of farms in Kyrgyzstan, 22% in East Germany. In India, I have been suggesting another route, which is that we have 2.5 million rural self-help groups, 2.5 million rural self-help groups, of which 2.3 are all women groups. And these are groups that can vary from 6 to 10 women who basically rotate credit among each other, but for individual family enterprises. However, with some encouragement and support from the government, they could actually take up joint enterprises. Some are already doing it, but they could take up, for instance, group farming. Now, there are many more examples of group farming. If you actually open, if you read newspapers, you'll find every now and again you come up with other examples, not just women doing group farming, but in India the other day I saw that in northwest India, male farmers, in order to take advantage of cold storage, which had just come in, they couldn't manage it individually, but 14 farmers got together, pooled their land to cultivate vegetables and fruits in order to take advantage of the cold storage program. Now, I'm sometimes asked, when I present some of these ideas, look, are women's productivity is more likely to succeed than men's? I want to argue that evidence suggests that both would work, but possibly in different circumstances. And I would venture that women's collectivities could work better under subsistence when there is much more interdependence in an everyday kind, and possibly male-led collectivities could work better with high-value crop production, higher payoffs. But I think this is worthy of further research. Okay, now suppose you are with me and say we do increase production. How do we improve distribution? Now, where small and marginal farmers begin to produce their own food, the food at their command, of course, also increases. So you simultaneously take care of increased production and distribution. But in a nation, if you want to improve food production, distribution further, then there are many people who don't produce their own food, but they should be able to buy that food or to obtain it through other means. And here, there are many examples in South Asia and Latin America where you find that it is beginning to make a difference. A range of schemes. Some of these schemes are just increasing access to land in the hands of the poor, but there are other schemes. And one very interesting one and very recent one in India is targeted employment. In 2005, the government of India passed a law which guarantees 100 days of manual labor work at minimum wages to one person for every rural household. And a large percent of those seeking work are women. So this is a picture, as you see, of Indian women who are sitting down to work and they are waiting to obtain work. These are some of the, as you can see, the basket that they're carrying. Another way is that many countries in Latin America have been initiating schemes for conditional cash transfers to women for better nutritional outcomes for mothers and children. Why to women? Because a lot of evidence shows that if you transfer cash to women and to mothers conditionally, then they're more likely to spend that on children's welfare than if you transfer the same to male heads of households. Then there are efforts of old schemes but rejuvenated. For example, we've had a very long-standing in India public distribution system where poor are given food grains at subsidized prices. There are also issues of midday meals at schools and so on. And very recent studies, just studies that I saw the results last month, showed that both the employment guarantee and the public distribution schemes have made significant improvement in nutrition of poor households. This is another example of law where you the country takes responsibility for food security. And there has been a long-standing movement. It's a Right to Food campaign. There's a bill in Parliament in India. It hasn't yet been passed, but you'll see again, this is one of the local meetings. It's a countrywide campaign, and if it is successful, then there will be all India, there will be guaranteed attempt as a right to food, one element of which is to provide adequate food grains to every family at very low cost, but there are other elements to that program. Now, I don't have time to go into the relative efficacy of these measures, but what is important that I want to emphasize is that it means the recognition of providing food for all is not only an individual responsibility, but it is a social responsibility. And, of course, a fifth element that I want to talk about is forests. Now, this is another scheme. It's not even a scheme. It's really a program which picked up in the 1990s, where degraded forest land was given over to local communities to protect and manage. And if you see this, this is 5 years of protection. There's a slight difference in season, but nevertheless, you can see, this part. This lower slide comes from this part is the lower slide. So you see this not only in, if you move around India and Nepal, for instance, of the greening of forests, but you also see this in terms of satellite data, because you find that forest area in India has increased by 3.6 million hectares between 1991 and 2001, when it was actually declining hugely per year prior to that. So here is another example of community management of local resources which have made a huge difference. And there are, just in 2000, there were 84,000 community forestry groups in India, and those have been increasing over time, covering 8 million households and 22.5% of forest land. So this is just one village, and further, the book of mine, which has just got published, shows that involving women in forest management actually further improves, it demonstrably improves forest conservation. Okay, well, the third part is preparation and management. Making food good for all would also mean clean cooking energy, making that available for all. And as I'd already said, unprocessed biofuels that are used by millions is life-threatening. Now, improved stoves is something that has been talked about for 3 decades, and I find it suddenly increasing, it's receiving global attention. So just about 10 days ago, I believe, or maybe less, Hillary Clinton was on the web. You could see it in the news, where she was also talking about clean stoves. And so here is an example of a clean stove, if you remember the earlier kitchen. And basically, it has a chimney, and it is a clean stove. But, I think there's a big but here. If you notice, the fuel she's using is still firewood. And using firewood means you depend on forests, and you have long journeys. So I believe clean cooking fuel, clean stoves, but using unclean fuels is not the answer. So what is the answer? Well, possibly in some distant future, solar energy, but many can't afford it, and their kitchens are not adapted for their use. I believe an affordable clean fuel is biogas, or biomass-based energy. Biogas is basically methane and carbon dioxide, and it's produced when you have a biological breakdown of organic matter in the absence of oxygen. Now, the gas can be piped to kitchens, and there is a slurry left over which is very rich, which can be used as organic manure. So here's an example of just a stylized diagram of, you have the, it's very simple, you can build it, families can build it, the gas is piped out, dung and water is fed in, and you can take out the sludge. And there is here's a rural India, here's a photograph of a biogas plant, and here, there should have been an image of a woman cooking in it. But I do want to share with you that, and China, for instance, has done it hugely. They have 27 million biogas plants, covering 10% of the population. But just Yesterday, a friend of mine who's now in the audience, and she was visiting from the University of Minnesota in Morris, and I understand that they are now, they have a biomass plant, and their entire heating and cooling on campus, and all the food they cook in the kitchens on campus comes from biomass energy. So here is an example where it works. It could work in rural India and Bangladesh and Africa, and it could work in the United States. But you may have something to say on that. And finally, so I've talked really about the local challenges. What could countries do for increasing production, distribution, clean preparation? But I believe there are also international responsibilities and challenges. And here are some you might add to that. First, we need global cooperation on research and development for technological change in agriculture to increase yields and mitigate climate change. We need high-yielding crop, water-conserving crops which can withstand heat stress and pest attacks. But the question is, who will do this R&D? Because today, R&D is concentrated on crops in a few countries, USA, China, Brazil, India, and there are private players, but they're not necessarily going to do the research that you need. What we need is strengthening of global bodies. Yesterday, we had a wonderful example of preserving seeds of international proactivism on that, but there are other systems like strengthening the CGIAR system. There's the Borlaug Global Rust Initiative as well. But for success, we need not only generic crop varieties, but also adaptation. I believe the second issue, which is a challenge, is the question of GM foods. We haven't yet discussed that very much in this conference, but GM foods could have effect on neighbors if one country invests in them. What impact does it have on other countries? We have issues of pests which move across national boundaries. And again, I believe there is an issue of international responsibility here. So we need cooperation and consensus on where to go with GM foods. The third is, even if we increase production in developing countries, food production in developed countries could decline. So for instance, this example I gave at the beginning of my talk of land moving from food to feed to fuel, the question of ethanol and so on. And I believe there is scope for a global dialogue to provide more balance on land use for different needs. Fourth, and this is something which international organizations are talking about, is buffer stocks, regionally and internationally. So for instance, we need cooperation in order to tide situations where there are food scarcity. And nations do it, but I think internationally we need more cooperation on that. The FAO is doing some work on that, but there are other initiatives which are needed. And finally, I do want to say that lifestyles and diets, we need perhaps some global responsibility for changing lifestyles and food habits. Because traditionally, food habits reflected diversity, which was ecological and cultural diversity. But today, as we noted from the McDonald's pictures and other pictures, that food habits are spreading globally. You know, America does set a trend. And I was very impressed that when smoking became not cool in America, it actually began to be not cool in many parts, and in Europe, it began not to be cool in many other parts of the world. And I do believe that a move towards healthy food in the Western world will have a lot of impact on children and families in a developing world as well. So let me end with some concluding comments. We know that food is so basic a need that it really does require global responsibility to make sure that everyone has the capacity for partaking of good food. But the efforts to make good food available to all and to make food, but particularly good food, available to all, we have both national and international challenges, and we have climate change. So solutions, I want to emphasize, lie not just in technologies and in practices, but in new institutional arrangements. It is about how we cooperate with each other. It's about collective action. It's about grassroots action, which came up yesterday as well. And cooperation, I believe, both at the community level and nationally and internationally, is absolutely key for increasing production and sharing what we produce globally more equitably. Now, as part of the global architecture, We need global institutions, of course, for food security. Some might even say we need a new global world order. But it should be an order in which the poor and women in low-income countries are seen not just as the main victims of the food crisis, but I believe they are a critical and key part of the solution. Thank you.
All right, let us reconvene. There are people walking around who will collect your questions if you have questions. And I also wanted to remind you that there is a very wonderful, interesting exhibit in the forum next door. I won't point because I'll get it the wrong direction. I've only been here 22 years. But please do avail yourself of the exhibits next door. Thanks. I wonder if there are any panelists who would like to begin with a question for Bina Agarwal. Yes.
I have a question. Bina, I learned so much from you, and thank you so very much. I'm very interested in India, and I'm curious about the right to food legislation. And I'd heard a little bit about the possibility of the food distribution system shifting from simply a centralized white rice distribution to using locally produced and more diverse foods as part of the food security system. And I wonder if that's just a rumor or is that a possibility?
Well, the Right to Food campaign, of course, is a very broad-ranging, has broad-ranging dimensions because they're talking not just about distribution, but also production. Essentially, that the government and their social responsibility so that there's no hunger. So it should be a part of it, but not in terms of the distributional network. So the public distribution system works on the basis of government procuring surplus food grains and then providing them to shops which distribute them at low prices to the poor, people who are below the poverty line, for instance. So those shops probably will not carry the more biodiverse produce of local regions. However, I think as a general concept of the right to food, and if you go into production, then much more biodiverse, less monoculture should be a part of it. And those are at the moment smaller and side conversations in this.
I have one.
Yes,
Yeah.
Miriam.
Bina, thank you so much for that inspiring talk. I was so interested in your focus on women and really what are women's empowerment kinds of activities. And I wondered what kind of opposition you come up against in this work.
You know, on some aspects, for instance, it's not, my prior work, the book before this, was on the whole issue of women's inheritance rights, women's rights to land, because it was very little recognized, really, that women are the farmers, and increasingly the face of the farmer is a woman, but she lacks the key resource, productive resource, which is land. So I do remember when I first presented that idea in 1989 in the Indian Planning Commission. And you had the Minister of Agriculture and the Planning Minister, and you had all the major key figures. And one of the responses was, are you suggesting women should have rights to land? What do women want? To break up the family? However, that was 1989. And we've moved very substantially since then. And now in most of the government schemes for distributing land, whether it's through resettlement or through land reform programs, there is a recognition that either the land should go only to the woman, but more typically that it should be a joint title, and both spouses should have a right to it. One of the ideas I've been talking about, however, is that instead of distributing land to individual families or to individuals, why don't we create small land trusts in villages in which groups of families and groups of poor women would have access to the land for use, but not for inheritance. And if daughters-in-law move in, they create a right there, and they use the land and then for subsistence. Daughters tend to marry out, and perhaps in the next village, you might have a similar land trust where she could establish a right. So that is more of an idea. Some of the non-governmental organizations and civil society groups have been trying that out. And just very recently, there was a whole launch of a national campaign by a group in South India. They held a consultation in Delhi where they said, we are going to do collective farming by women farmers and do it as a national campaign. So I spoke with them, and the immense amount of energy they brought to the idea. They said, we'd read some of your work, and we feel really that we'd like to take it forward. And what more can an academic want than to have people on the ground who are actually doing the organizing to say, here is an idea that we would like to carry forward. So there has been opposition, but I think now the opposition is really on the ground of people who are trying to implement the ideas.
Any other questions from the panel? Paul?
One question would be, are there any specific or changes in law and policy? And I think this audience would be particularly interested in ways in which the United States might change some of its stance in international relations that would really facilitate the vision that you've described here this morning.
Well, one of the issues that I talked about, for instance, the whole issue of fuel and the use of land with massive subsidies in order to produce ethanol. I think that is an important factor because being an important food exporting country in situations of food crisis, if you have less to export, then it affects the global food situation. So I think that is one issue. There are also issues about research and development. What kinds of seeds and what sorts of research does a country invest in? And America is one of the countries which invests greatly in research. You also have private corporations. So the kind of understanding and reflection that I heard among panelists yesterday, that could be brought to bear in a larger scale. And also strengthening, for instance, the CGIAR institutions, which are doing research globally. There are the wheat varieties, rice varieties emerged from these institutions, and they are much more sensitive to global problems. The issues we talked about yesterday on climate change, that the heat stress, the certain varieties are just not going to be able to stand that, and most of these varieties really crops fall in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which are going to be most affected by climate change. So research on crops which can withstand, which are water conserving and stand heat stress, and I think, again, the United States, which is a major funder of research, could play an important role. And finally, to this audience, I would say that, lifestyles, as I said, are really global. So the conversations that we have in one country about the importance of having simpler lifestyles, much more sustainable, less consumerist, what we eat, what we wear, how we eat it, how we cook it. But all these have an impact globally. And children in particular, as I said, they see what's happening in other countries. They watch television. And so if there is a movement, say in the United States, towards a different way of having a good life, then that would have an impact, I think, in many parts of the world of having a good life which is much more sustainable, it seems to me.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to put three questions together that I think are maybe driving at the same point. The ultimate question is sort of, does the math work? Are these solutions workable for feeding the world 40 years from now? And under that head, I'll ask, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the collectivity model as opposed to moving to larger scale industrial agriculture? And what are the benefits of keeping those food collectivities organic versus other methods that may yield in higher yields, result in higher yields? So can this do it?
Well, you know, there are millions and millions of farmers in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and also some parts of Latin America, who are really small farmers. So the option of large industrial farming doesn't exist at this point. You know, if you remember those graphs, 60 to 70% or more of the population is still dependent on agriculture, and these are very small farms. The idea of a collectivity is that you don't move towards large commercial farming, but you do take advantage of creating from these very small farms something that is much more medium-sized, but bottom-up. So if you have a 2-hectare farm and you form a collectivity with 10 others, then you have 20 hectares, which is a small, medium, if you like, farm. And that would have advantages. And the particular advantages are that it's much more participatory. It's, you know, you don't have large mechanized farming. You have wheat farming, which is mechanized to some extent, for instance, in South Asia. So your land preparation is maybe mechanized. Threshing and harvesting to some extent is mechanized, but a lot of the other operations are not. Rice farming is pretty much not mechanized, except land preparation. So what you're really talking about is wanting to produce employment and livelihoods for very large numbers, not throw them out of work, and at the same time increase productivity. And it seems to me, therefore, that the disadvantages of the very tiny farms could be overcome by creating these medium-sized farms, and they're also democratic. They're participative. You make choices. And these are farms where both men and women can have a say in what is grown. The issue of organic farming is much more complicated, it seems to me, because organic farming is, of course, desirable. But not all the smaller collectivities may go in for organic farming. It's not also necessary that they need to do subsistence farming. I mean, they may do a commercial. I remember talking to a woman in Rajasthan, and she was growing she had a little bit of water, and she was growing onions. And she said, am I doing it wrong? Should I be only growing crops for my family? And I did some calculations for her, and I said to you, are you able to buy what you need for your family in the local store? And she said, yes. And I can make a little bit of profit from which I can buy other items for the children. So I said, then you're doing it okay. So I think we need to think about different models and have a respect for local choices. What we want to be able to do is to increase people's choices in terms of what they grow, give them the information without imposing particular conditions on what they should grow.
Can I interject?
Sure. Yes.
I was so interested when I went to India to visit Vandana Shiva's experimental farm, where they're trying to have small farmers grow very diverse crops on very small plots of land, as I understand this, so that they have subsistence farming, but then also have small amounts left over that they can sell.
No, that's right.
And they're giving the seeds away, so to
the Andhra Pradesh, the South India women's groups that I talked about, some of them grow up to 20 varieties, and it's unirrigated, but it really provides you a cushioning. If one crop fails, you can still harvest the other crop, and there are different seasons at which different crops mature. So that's also very helpful. And they have also what they call, on the boundaries of the fields, instead of growing thorny bushes, they grow crops which the cattle won't eat. So they use even the boundaries of the fields in that particular way. There are, all of these they're doing organic farming. But I feel that we don't need to insist on organic farming for livelihoods. For all crops across the country.
I like your idea of choice.
And having more choice. Was there a second part to your question?
No, I think that accommodated
Okay.
that question. A number of questions are coming in about the matter of biomass, particularly about the technology, and I wanted to tell those who are interested in the specifics of that we will get some information from Bina and post it on the Nobel web page. So if you want to, say, build one in your backyard, we will make that possible for you. But there was a specific question about the results of that technology, and that is, can you comment on the use of biomass and biofuel? Will that displace food sources, or will it displace arable land? In other words, will the production of biofuel?
No, basically you're using what is left over. So the crop waste, cattle dung, you basically use what are leftovers in your field or in your homes, things that you cook and you discard after you cook, these cotton bits of whatever you cook, vegetables, your kitchen waste, and you put that in with water, and it's controlled, it's limited oxygen, so it's controlled, and it ferments, and essentially, therefore, under those controlled conditions, what you get is primarily methane and carbon dioxide, and you pipe that. So what you do need is enough biomass. Now, earlier when I looked at biogas plants in India about 20 years ago, I found that the design was such that you needed 4 head of cattle to have one function to produce enough biomass to go into it, if you wanted to use it throughout the year. However, there are new designs that I've seen where you could use 1 or 2 head of cattle as well. And it's a question of redesigning that technology. If you don't want to even supplement it, suppose you don't use it for the entire year, use it for 6 months or 4 months, that itself would be a major energy boost and reduce energy poverty in many of these, many households. There is a new idea also in the energy policy, the government's energy policy report, which is that because individual families, and especially women, sometimes find it difficult to find the time to collect the biomass, and it's not enough, you could have one that is commercially viable. Say a village youth who's not employed could invest and set one up, collect the biomass from different households, and then pipe the water. Or in some way find cylinders that you store and provide it locally. So that example, it seemed to me, was an interesting example because it would be somebody who could make a living out of it and yet provide you clean fuel very, very locally if individual families weren't able to build one of their own.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. But it's, Morris has, it's very interesting, the University of Minnesota at Morris has done it for the entire university. So I would suggest go check it out.
No kidding, no kidding. Yeah. Please address the role of microfinance in local food production. And if I could interject there also, can you comment at all about the role of organizations like Kiva from the, you're not familiar with Kiva, organizations that are inviting, say, US and European individuals to engage in microloans to people worldwide?
Well, microfinance is quite contested. You have many models of microfinance. You have the Grameen model, which has worked in many, in Bangladesh, and it's of course become a global model. Now, the important part to me of that model is the principles on which microfinance was started, which is very poor, landless, groups of 5. If you remember those principles when I was talking about the collectivity, they were small, they were homogeneous, they were voluntary. And so you have that example. I'm not sure that there is information on what proportion of that actually goes into farming enterprises, but typically the microfinance goes into family enterprises, some of which could be farming, or it could be some other enterprise that the family is working on. The other kind of example which I had in mind when I talked about self-help groups is slightly different, because there what you have is voluntarily, say, a group, typically women get together. It could be 6 to 10 to 15 women, and they rotate saving initially, their own savings among the group. Now, this is a model you find also in Africa and many other parts of the world. What is different is that the Indian government has then said that after 6 months of successful functioning, we are going to do a matching grant of the amount of savings you have, and you can rotate that. However, if you take one leap further and use that, because typically the loan rotates, so if we are a group and we rotate it, say Marion gets the first loan and she uses it for a family enterprise, but it is not a group activity. And what I'm suggesting is that we could move towards all of us then pooling our resources and actually, say, doing fishiculture or poultry farming. But also we could do farming. We could lease in land and jointly cultivate it. And since you already have finance at your command and you are somewhat familiar with the system of credit, you could use that very productively. Some tea companies in India, actually 90% of their tea is being produced by self-help groups. So there are examples where they're doing fish cultivation jointly. And if you think about it, there are numerous groups across Asia and elsewhere who are protecting forests. Now, that is a group activity. So we have accepted, I think, over the past 20 years in development that groups empower people and small groups work and people can cooperate. The particular leap we haven't taken yet is that why don't we cooperate in order to jointly do farming for food security? Now, that's the additional point. And if we could take that leap, I think it would be possible to provide localized cooperative food security for families and for communities. Anyway, it's a model, one of the basket of models that is worth trying, it seems to me. And here, microcredit would just be the base. The self-help groups would be the base, but would not be the end product of the enterprise. The enterprise would have to go further.
Here's a more technical question about a particular economic theorist. The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto suggests that, 1, the governments of most poor countries are the enemy of the poor, and 2, that land titles are very rare for the poor and a large impediment to improved agriculture. What is your opinion?
It could mean, yeah, it's a long. Okay, so the first part is, I think it depends on what kind of government you're talking about, because there are governments need to be accountable. It seems to me that if we don't hold governments accountable for providing food security and basic needs, then where will the responsibility rest? I don't see the governments as necessarily the enemies of the poor, but governments, if they're responsive to the poor, could actually promote programs. And we have many examples, it seems to me, the examples that I talked about today, the Right to Food campaign, but also the public distribution system, the employment guarantee scheme. Now, that requires a government to back it and provide the finances in order for it to work for the poor, because no private individual would be able to do that. We also have, but we need government accountability. And one other innovation which has taken place is the Right to Information campaign. And this is, again, a grassroots campaign which was initiated by a group in Northwest India and Rajasthan. And it has now become a law in the country, and by which you can actually ask. So for instance, let us say, who's the richest among this group? Paul?
Philosophers are generally the richest.
So let us say he's in charge of the local village council, and the government's given him funds to build a road or a local dam. And we find after 3 years that Paul is sitting with his pipe, and there is no road, and there's no local check dam. So we get together, and we have a right to information, and we ask you, well, what happened to the funds that the government sanctioned? And you, by law, Paul will have to then tell us what happened to the money. And this has become a way of holding governments accountable to the poor. And so I think there are mechanisms that we can build in, and we have many lessons that we learn. I think De Soto might have seen that in his last visit to India, which wasn't so long ago. The second question is that land titles are very rare for the poor and are large,
And our impediments to improved agriculture.
Giving them land titles?
The absence
No,
of
the absence.
Oh, I agree with that. I think
Said that, actually.
and I've been talking about it, I think, almost probably long before De Soto was talking about it, which is certainly when I started writing about this from the mid-1980s, that land titles, access to land, I would say, is absolutely key. Because it's the difference between being destitute and having a fallback. So even if you don't have enough land to completely subsist on its own, having a piece of land means that when you have greater bargaining power, if you're going into the wage market, most of the poor have a mixed portfolio. As we know, all sensible people in finance diversify their portfolio. So the poor diversify their portfolio in order to reduce risk. And having land actually strengthens the rest of their portfolio. So if you have a piece of land, then you don't have to sell your labor at the lowest price. You can actually hold back. And there's plenty of studies to show that those with even a small piece of land can actually get higher wages in the labor market than if you have none. And so on that, I absolutely agree. Again, the government can play a very positive role in enabling that by either providing subsidized credit and grants for poor people to purchase land, but also transferring land to the poor, giving them access, much more than has been happening. But increasing access through the market, through the state, and through the family. Because, in India, for instance, 96% of a very large proportion of agricultural land, I think almost 96% of arable land is privately owned, which means that access to that must be is typically through the family or through the market. And therefore, the schemes that you have for equal inheritance claims are extremely important in the long run for women. It is not just that this affects only a very small proportion. Actually, very tiny bits of land are owned by very large numbers of families, 70 to 80% of families. So rights to that can make a significant difference to your security. Thank you.
I think we should conclude this session, and I encourage you again to visit the exhibits, to have a nice lunch, and to return in the afternoon for Linda Bartoshuk.